My old sheepdog Rusty was just chasing rabbits when he unearthed something behind the ancient stone wall that would change my life forever. That weathered trunk, buried for over a century, didn't just contain faded letters and photographs. It revealed that my humble farming family shares bloodlines with one of Europe's most powerful royal houses, and there are people who would stop at nothing to keep this connection buried forever. Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you're fascinated by hidden family histories, make sure you're subscribed, because next week I'll show you a royal heirloom from that trunk that I haven't revealed to anyone else. My name is Connor MacKenzie, fourth-generation farmer on this 80-acre piece of land my great-grandfather settled back in 1891, just outside of Glendale, Scotland. My family has worked this soil through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, countless storms, and personal tragedies. The MacKenzie Farm has endured it all, until now. These days, small family farms like mine are becoming increasingly rare. Caught between corporate agriculture giants, extreme weather patterns, and relentless development that's claiming agricultural land at an alarming rate. The irony isn't lost on me that my farm is failing, despite being situated on what was once considered some of the most fertile land in the county. My grandmother, Moira, used to sit by the fireplace on winter evenings, cradling her teacup, as she told me stories about how our ancestors had chosen this particular plot because of its unique microclimate and rich soil. "The land speaks to those who listen, Connor," she would say, her eyes distant with memories, "and this land has chosen the Mackenzies as its voice." Those poetic sentiments seem like hollow fantasies now as I look out at my struggling fields, wondering if I'll manage even one more harvest before the bank takes everything my family has built over 4 generations. Last autumn, I was facing the harsh reality that I might be the last Mackenzie to work this land. 3 consecutive years of unprecedented rainfall had devastated my crops. First came the flooding that washed away my entire barley crop before harvest. Then the soil fungus that spread through my potato fields after weeks of unrelenting dampness. The following year brought even heavier rains that turned parts of the farm into virtual swampland. No matter what adjustments I made or how carefully I planned, the changing climate seemed determined to break both my spirit and my bank account. Modern farming methods had transformed everything around me. Neighboring farms that embraced industrial techniques and chemical-intensive practices seemed to weather the storms better, though at what cost to the land remained to be seen. As a smaller operation committed to more traditional methods, I found myself increasingly unable to compete. The expensive equipment, proprietary seeds, and specialized chemicals that larger operations could afford were simply beyond my reach. Each season, the gap between my methods and those of the massive agribusinesses grew wider, along with the gap in our respective profits. The soil that had nourished my family for generations now seemed to be giving up on me, or perhaps I was giving up on it. Every morning, I found it harder to pull on my boots and face another day of what increasingly felt like a losing battle against forces far beyond my control. Every morning, I'd check my email with growing dread. The bank's messages became increasingly urgent about the overdue mortgage payments, each one more formal and threatening than the last. The most recent notice gave me just 60 days to make good on my payments or face foreclosure proceedings. Meanwhile, Harrington Estates, the luxury property developer buying up struggling farms throughout the county to build exclusive countryside retreats marketed to wealthy city dwellers, had made 3 offers on my property. Each offer was more substantial than the last, as if they could sense my mounting desperation. The latest email contained digital renderings of what they called MacKenzie Manor, a sprawling complex of high-end holiday homes where generations of my family had once grown food to feed the nation. Seeing my family name co-opted for their development felt like salt in an already painful wound. My neighbour Ian Campbell had already surrendered to the inevitable. His family's farm had stood alongside ours for nearly as long, 170 years of shared boundaries, shared equipment, shared struggles. Last month, I'd watched him sign the final paperwork transferring his property to Harrington Estates, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he surrendered his family legacy for a sum that probably wouldn't sustain him through his remaining years. The bulldozers arrived the very next day, tearing down the stone cottage his grandfather had built after returning from the First World War. I stood at our property line watching as they erased generations of Campbell history in a single afternoon. "You can't fight progress, Connor," Ian had told me later that evening, his eyes fixed on his whiskey glass rather than meeting mine. His voice carried the hollow resignation of a man trying to convince himself he'd made the right choice. Farming's a dying way of life these days. The big operations and developers have already won. Take the money while they're still offering it. At least then something of your family's work survives. Perhaps he was right. Maybe small farmers like us were just stubborn relics, clinging to an outdated way of life in a world that had moved on. The Harrington offer sitting on my kitchen table represented more money than I'd ever see from farming. It could pay off my debts, fund a comfortable life somewhere else, perhaps even start a small business in town. But every time I picked up the phone to accept their offer, I could almost hear my grandmother Moira's voice echoing across the years. "This land doesn't just grow crops, Connor. It grows stories, and some stories aren't finished telling themselves yet." I was desperate for a solution, any solution. The foreclosure date was just 2 months away, and I didn't have nearly enough to make the payment. The crop insurance wouldn't cover half my losses from last season's flooding, and equipment repairs had drained what little savings I had left. The tractor was making an ominous grinding sound that I couldn't afford to have diagnosed. The irrigation system needed updating. The barn roof had started leaking. Each day brought a new problem I lacked the resources to fix. Something had to change, or this would be the last spring a MacKenzie planted these fields. That's when I remembered my grandmother Moira's stories about the royal secret that was supposedly hidden somewhere on our property. As a child, I'd assumed it was just another fanciful tale, like her stories about the fairy folk who supposedly lived beneath the stone circle on the North Ridge, or the phantom bagpipes she claimed could be heard on misty mornings. Grandmother Moira would speak in hushed tones about how her grandfather, my great-great-grandfather William MacKenzie, had once been entrusted with a terrible secret during the late Victorian era. "The old man carried a burden few could imagine," she would whisper, even decades after any danger had passed. "He was keeper of truths that could topple thrones and rewrite the pages of history books." According to family legend, William had been more than just the Scottish farmer he appeared to be. Grandmother claimed he had once been a trusted servant in a great European royal household, though she never specified which one. During his service, he had supposedly become entangled in some royal scandal of such magnitude that he was forced to flee to Scotland with his young family, changing their name and hiding their past. "He brought something with him," Grandmother would say, her eyes darting to the windows as if still worried about eavesdroppers after all these years. "A trunk filled with evidence that could never see the light of day, not until the right time, and came. He buried it somewhere on this land, telling only his eldest son of its location and making him swear to pass the secret down through generations. The key phrase, she said, was, 'When the crown is threatened by lies, truth must rise from Scottish soil.' This cryptic instruction was supposedly the trigger for when the Mackenzies should unearth whatever William had hidden. As a practical farmer, my father had little patience for what he called Moira's royal fairy tales. He focused on crops and livestock, not centuries-old family mysteries. The stories became just another piece of family folklore, trotted out at holidays, but never taken seriously. After grandmother passed away 15 years ago, the tales were rarely mentioned at all. With nothing to lose but a few hours, I probably should have spent repairing fence posts. I decided to see if there was any truth to these old stories. What I didn't expect was how that decision would unearth not just a physical artifact, but long-buried secrets that would change everything. For me, for this farm, and for our understanding of one of Europe's most enduring royal dynasties. That evening I found myself in our farmhouse attic, surrounded by generations of family artifacts. The air was thick with dust and memories, heavy with the scent of old wood and forgotten treasures. Ancient trunks and weathered furniture crowded. Beneath the sloped ceiling, each piece silent witness to my family's history. I hadn't been up here in years, not since my father passed away, and I inherited both the farm and its burdens. I came looking for anything that might shed light on Grandmother Moira's stories about the royal secret. If such a thing truly existed, there had to be some record of it, some clue to its location beyond fading oral traditions. In the far corner sat my grandmother's hope chest, its pine surface dulled by decades of handling. I remembered how she'd let me peek inside as a child, showing me treasures she claimed were only meaningful to those who know their stories. Back then, I was more interested in playing outside than listening to an old woman's tales. Now, I desperately wished I'd paid more attention. The chest's hinges groaned as I lifted the lid, releasing the scent of lavender and old fabric. Inside lay neatly folded quilts, yellowed lace handkerchiefs, and bundles of letters tied with faded ribbons. Beneath these, I found a small leather-bound book, my grandmother's journal, its pages brittle and browned at the edges. As I carefully turned the delicate pages, I realized this wasn't just any diary. It contained stories her grandfather, William MacKenzie, had told her, recorded in her precise handwriting. Stories about his life before Scotland, about the royal household he served, about the terrible choice he made that forced him to flee with his family. Grandfather told me today about the Glenning Stone, one entry from 1959 read. Said it marks the spot where he buried the evidence, midway between the old well and the boundary stone on the north field. Said what lies beneath must remain hidden, until the day when falsehood wears the crown. When I asked what that meant, he said I would know when the time came. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the attic's drafty windows. The Glenning Stone, I knew exactly where it was. A large peculiar rock that sat half-buried in the north pasture, near where the stone wall made a sharp turn eastward. My father had tried to remove it once when I was a boy, wanting to expand the tillable acreage, but his tractor chain had snapped, and he'd declared the stone too stubborn to move and left it where it sat. Another entry caught my eye, dated June 15th, 1963. Grandfather showed me the marker today, a simple carving on the underside of the Glenning Stone, a crown with a diagonal line through it. He made me promise never to mention it to outsiders. Some secrets need to stay buried, until revealing them can heal rather than harm, he said. The journal contained other cryptic references, measurements paced from the old oak tree to the stone, mentions of the royal burden, and papers that would shake the foundations of the palace, lists of items supposedly buried in a trunk, including letters, photographs, a royal seal, and what Moira enigmatically called the proof of blood. Most intriguing was a hand-drawn map tucked between the pages, showing the northern section of the farm as it had looked in the late 19th century. The Glenning Stone was clearly marked, along with several other landmarks, many of which no longer existed. A dotted line connected various points, forming what appeared to be a triangulation system across the property, ending at a spot near the stone marked with a small X. As I studied these materials, my grandmother's voice seemed to whisper from the pages. These weren't just stories meant to entertain a child on winter evenings. They were deliberately preserved clues, passed down through generations, waiting for someone who might need them. Waiting perhaps for a moment when the farm itself needed saving. I spent hours in that attic, piecing together fragments of information from the journal, old letters and family photographs. What emerged was a picture far more complex than I'd imagined. William MacKenzie hadn't been simply a Scottish immigrant farmer. According to these records, he'd been a confidant to royalty, entrusted with dangerous knowledge that could destabilize a throne. The more I read, the more I began to understand why William had buried the evidence after fleeing to Scotland. Whatever he knew, whatever proof he possessed, it implicated powerful people whose descendants might still wield enough influence to destroy anyone who threatened their carefully constructed narrative. But there was something else, something mentioned repeatedly but never fully explained. References to the bloodline proof, the true heir, and legitimacy denied. Whatever these items were, William had considered them important enough to preserve, but dangerous enough to conceal. As midnight approached, I found myself surrounded by piles of family history, my mind racing with possibilities. If the trunk existed, if it had remained buried and undisturbed for over a century, what condition would its contents be in? Could there truly be historically significant artifacts preserved inside? And if so, what would they be worth? That last question gave me pause. I wasn't thinking about historical value or national significance. I was calculating potential financial value, wondering if whatever lay hidden might be valuable enough to save the farm from foreclosure. Artifacts with royal connections that could be sold to museums or private collectors for enough to clear my debts. I immediately felt a stab of guilt. My ancestor had hidden these items to protect both them and our family, not so they could be sold off by a desperate descendant 4 generations later. Yet what choice did I have? The farm would be lost regardless if I couldn't make the mortgage payments. At least this way, I might preserve the land itself, even if I had to sacrifice whatever history lay beneath it. With this uncomfortable rationalization, I carefully returned the journal and papers to the hope chest, except for the map, which I tucked into my pocket. Tomorrow, I decided, I would search for whatever might be buried near the Glenning stone. If Grandmother Moira's records were accurate, it might lead me to the hidden trunk and its royal secrets. If not, I'd have wasted a day I couldn't spare on a wild goose chase born of desperation. As I turned off the attic light, a strange feeling settled over me, the sense that I was being watched by unseen eyes, not in a threatening way, but as if the past itself was observing my actions, judging my intentions. I told myself it was just exhaustion combined with too many hours spent among the relics of the dead. Back in my bedroom, I placed the fragile map on my nightstand and tried to sleep. But my dreams were filled with royal processions moving through my fields, figures in crowns and ceremonial robes, their faces bearing my family's features. They seemed to be searching for something, or perhaps warning me about what I was about to find. I awoke at dawn, the map still beside me, my mind made up. Historical guilt and ghostly warnings aside, I needed to know if the trunk existed. The farm's survival might depend on it. Within the hour, I was in the north pasture with Rusty, my faithful sheepdog, headed toward the Glenning stone where generations of secrets supposedly lay buried. What I couldn't know then was that breaking the seal on that long-hidden trunk wouldn't just potentially save my farm. It would unearth truths that powerful people had worked for generations to keep buried, triggering a battle for ownership of history itself. The northern section of our farm had always been different from the rest. Less fertile, more rocky, with subtle undulations in the landscape that made it difficult to plough. My father had primarily used it for grazing sheep, and in recent years I'd let much of it grow wild, focusing my limited resources on the more productive southern fields. As I made my way along the overgrown path, morning dew soaked through my boots, and Rusty bounded ahead, disappearing occasionally into the tall grass, only to reappear moments later, tongue lolling with excitement at this early adventure. Nature had been reclaiming this area for years, almost as if it were protecting something beneath its tangled growth. Ancient hawthorn and gorse had spread unchecked, creating natural barriers that I now had to navigate around. The morning mist still clung to the lower spots, giving the landscape an otherworldly quality. The spring sun was burning through the mist as I approached the spot where the Glenning stone had stood for as long as anyone could remember. According to the map, this natural formation marked the northern boundary of the original MacKenzie property. Over generations, we had acquired adjacent lands, pushing our boundaries outward, but this stone had remained a constant reference point, a silent sentinel guarding whatever secrets might lie beneath it. I paused to get my bearings, the old map clutched in my hand. The paper had grown even more fragile in the morning humidity, forcing me to handle it with extreme care. Looking from the map to the landscape and back again, I tried to reconcile what my grandmother had documented with what now existed. The contours of the land remained largely the same, but trees had grown where once there were clearings, and what had been described as a small stream was now just a marshy depression. According to the map, the exact burial spot should be approximately 15 paces southeast of the Glenning stone. I stood before the massive rock, worn smooth on one side by centuries of Scottish weather. It stood about waist-high, its grey-green surface mottled with lichen and moss. This was the stone my father's tractor couldn't budge, the stone that had frustrated his attempts to expand our tillable acreage. Remembered my grandmother's journal entry about a marking on the underside of the stone. Kneeling in the damp grass, I peered underneath the rock's overhanging edge. Years of soil accumulation had partially buried the base, making it difficult to see anything. I took out my pocket knife and began carefully scraping away layers of dirt and root material from the underside. After several minutes of awkward excavation, my blade scraped against something that wasn't stone or soil. Careful cleaning revealed exactly what grandmother had described, a crude carving of a crown with a diagonal line through it, the universal symbol for no or forbidden. The carving was weathered but unmistakable, its edges softened by time, but its message still clear. My heart pounded as I stood and began pacing off the 15 steps indicated in the journal. Rusty watched me curiously, head tilted as I counted. Aloud. At the 15th pace, I found myself in a slight natural depression between two small rises in the landscape. Nothing obvious indicated a burial spot, but the journal had mentioned that William had hidden his secret beneath ordinary earth, marked by nothing that would draw unwanted eyes. The ground here appeared undisturbed for years, covered with the same wild grasses and occasional thistles that dominated the entire northern pasture. If something had been buried here a century ago, nature had thoroughly reclaimed the site, erasing any visible evidence of disturbance. I set down my backpack and took out the small folding shovel I'd brought. The first few strikes against the ground yielded only the typical resistance of Scottish soil, a mixture of clay, stone, and tangled roots. Rusty sat nearby, watching with apparent fascination as I began to dig a methodical test hole. After about 20 minutes of steady digging, I had created a pit roughly 2 feet deep, but found nothing unusual. Doubt began to creep into my thoughts. Perhaps the map was inaccurate. Perhaps I had misinterpreted the pacing directions, or worst of all, perhaps grandmother's stories were exactly what my father had always claimed, fanciful tales with no basis in reality. Wiping sweat from my brow, despite the cool morning air, I decided to try a slightly different spot. The journal had mentioned triangulating from both the Glenning stone and the old oak tree. I looked toward where that ancient tree had once stood, now marked only by a slight mound where its massive stump had finally rotted away. Recalculating the position based on both reference points, I moved about 6 feet to the west and began digging again. This time the shovel struck something solid about 18 inches down. The distinctive sound wasn't the dull thud of stone, but a hollow wooden resonance. Excitement surged through me as I began clearing soil more carefully, using the edge of the shovel to outline whatever lay beneath. Rusty, sensing my excitement, came closer, his tail wagging as he watched me work with growing intensity. Suddenly, he began pawing at the loose soil I'd excavated, his natural digging instinct activated by the smell of old wood and metal now emerging from the earth. "Easy, boy," I cautioned, but Rusty was already committed to helping. His powerful front paws scattered soil with remarkable efficiency, exposing more of what appeared to be a flat wooden surface. I let him continue for a few minutes, his instinctive digging accomplishing more than my careful shovel work. Within minutes, Rusty had exposed a significant portion of what was unmistakably the lid of an old trunk or chest. The wood was darkened with age, but appeared remarkably preserved, protected from the worst effects of moisture by the clay-heavy soil that had encased it. Metal banding was visible along the edges, the once bright brass now oxidized to a dull green. "Good boy, Rusty," I praised, scratching behind his ears as he looked up at me proudly, soil caking his muzzle. "You found it." With renewed energy, I worked to clear the earth from around the trunk, carefully exposing its full dimensions. It was smaller than I had imagined from grandmother's descriptions, about 2 feet long, 18 inches wide, and perhaps a foot deep. Just the right size to contain documents and small personal effects, but nothing particularly large. The most challenging part was freeing the trunk from the surrounding soil without damaging it. Decades of earth had compressed around it, creating a nearly concrete-like casing. I worked methodically, using my hands more than the shovel now, feeling around the edges of the trunk to loosen the soil's grip. After nearly an hour of careful excavation, I was finally able to rock the trunk slightly, breaking the vacuum seal that had held it fast. With a soft, sucking sound, it came free of its earthen vault, revealing itself fully for the first time in over a century. The trunk was a thing of beauty, crafted from oak and bound with brass fittings that, despite their tarnish, showed evidence of skilled craftsmanship. The lid featured an ornate lock mechanism in the shape of a shield, surprisingly intact despite its long burial. Most remarkable of all was a small symbol embossed into the leather that covered portions of the lid, a coat of arms that I didn't recognize, but that clearly belonged to a noble or royal house. I carefully lifted the trunk from its resting place, surprised by its substantial weight. Whatever was inside had significant mass. Setting it down on level ground, I examined the lock, wondering how I might open it without causing damage. To my surprise, a small brass key was attached to the underside of the trunk with a tarnished chain, my ancestor ensuring that whoever found the trunk would be able to access its contents. My hands trembled slightly as I detached the key and inserted it into the lock. A century of burial had not been kind to the mechanism. It resisted turning, the internal components likely stiffened with age and corrosion. I applied gentle but firm pressure, careful not to snap the fragile key. With a sudden, almost reluctant click, the lock finally yielded. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet pasture, as if announcing the release of long-held secrets. Rusty's ears perked up at the noise, and he moved closer, his curiosity matching my own. I hesitated before opening the lid, overcome by the significance of the moment. Whatever lay inside this trunk had been deliberately hidden by my great-great-grandfather, preserved through generations, waiting for this precise moment to be revealed. I felt the weight of that responsibility settling on my shoulders. Drawing a deep breath, I carefully lifted the lid. The hinges protested with a low creak, but held firm, as the contents of the trunk were exposed to daylight for the first time in over 100 years. The interior was lined with what appeared to be oilcloth, creating a remarkably effective moisture barrier that had protected the contents. Nestled within were several bundles wrapped in waxed canvas, each tied with faded ribbon and labeled in a precise, formal handwriting. Atop these packages lay a single envelope addressed simply, "To the finder. Open first." With reverent care, I lifted this envelope. The paper was yellowed but intact, the wax seal on the back still mostly whole, bearing the same coat of arms that was embossed on the trunk's lid. Breaking the seal gently, I withdrew a letter written in the same meticulous hand as the labels on the packages. "To my descendant," it began, "if you are reading this, then the need has finally arisen to reveal what I have kept hidden for the sake of many, including our own family. What you will find in this trunk is evidence of a truth that powerful people have worked to conceal, a truth of royal bloodlines, legitimate succession denied, and a throne occupied under false pretense." My hand shook as I continued reading the letter, which outlined in clear terms exactly why William MacKenzie had fled to Scotland with these documents, what they proved, and why they had been kept hidden for so long. The final paragraph struck me most deeply. "I entrust these materials to you, my unknown descendant, with the understanding that revealing them will bring both danger and responsibility. The MacKenzie name is not our original one, but it has become our true identity through honest labor on Scottish soil. Whatever you decide to do with these truths, know that they have waited patiently for the right moment, a moment when revealing them might heal rather than harm." The letter was signed William Reinhardt MacKenzie, formerly William Reinhardt von Tauschleben, Under-Secretary to His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, 1891. My mind reeled at the implications. The name von Tauschleben connected to one of Europe's oldest royal houses, a family that still occupied a throne to this day. If these documents contained what William claimed, they could potentially challenge the legitimacy of a current monarch. Setting the letter aside with trembling hands, I began to carefully unwrap the first of the canvas bundles. Inside were photographs, letters bearing royal seals, official documents with watermarks and signatures, and most significantly, what appeared to be a private marriage certificate and birth records that contradicted the official royal genealogy. As I carefully examined these materials, the enormity of what I discovered began to sink in. This wasn't just historically interesting material, it was explosive. These documents suggested that the current ruling line of a European monarchy had no legitimate claim to their throne, having ascended through what amounted to a carefully orchestrated usurpation, and somehow, through a twist of fate and bloodlines documented in these papers, my own family, the humble farming Mackenzies of Scotland, were descendants of the rightful royal line. The revelation was so overwhelming that I sat back on the damp grass, documents carefully arranged before me, trying to process the implications. Rusty, sensing my distress, came to sit beside me, his warm presence a comforting anchor to the present as my mind struggled to bridge past and future. What I held in my hands could potentially save my farm through their historical value alone, but they also carried an enormous burden, one that had already forced my ancestor to flee his homeland and live in exile. Would revealing these truths bring justice or merely destruction? Would they secure my future or place it in grave danger? As I carefully repacked the trunk's contents, one thing became increasingly clear. I was no longer just fighting to save a farm. I had become the custodian of a truth that had waited generations to be revealed, a truth with the power to rewrite royal history. What I couldn't possibly know as I lifted that trunk from the Scottish soil was that its discovery had already been noticed. Even as Rusty and I made our way back to the farmhouse, carrying our extraordinary burden, forces were already mobilizing. People who had spent generations ensuring that the secrets William MacKenzie buried would never see the light of day. By mid-afternoon, I had transformed my kitchen table into an impromptu research station. The contents of the trunk were carefully arranged across the wooden surface, organized chronologically as best I could determine. Rusty lay nearby, occasionally lifting his head to observe my work before returning to his well-earned nap. The mud from our morning's excavation still clung to his paws, but I couldn't bring myself to interrupt my examination of these extraordinary documents long enough to clean him up. The story that emerged from these papers was more remarkable than anything I could have imagined, a tale of royal intrigue, forbidden love, and systematic historical revision that spanned more than a century. According to the documents, my great-great-grandfather William had served as personal secretary to Crown Prince Edward of Hochwald, a small but strategically important European principality that had once wielded influence far beyond its modest size. William had been more than just a servant. He had been Edward's trusted confidant and friend since childhood. In 1889, Prince Edward had secretly married a woman named Charlotte Reinhardt, William's sister. Their union had been hidden from the royal court because Charlotte, despite her education and refinement, was a commoner. The marriage certificate I now held in my hands had been signed by a rural parish priest, with William and one other loyal servant serving as witnesses. Shortly after this secret marriage, Charlotte had given birth to a son, a child who, by all proper laws of succession, would be the legitimate heir to the Hochwald throne. The birth records and baptismal certificate confirmed this lineage, complete with official seals and signatures. But Prince Edward never had the chance to acknowledge his wife and child publicly. In late 1890, while traveling to arrange for their proper recognition, Edward was killed in what was officially recorded as a hunting accident. William's private journal, included among the trunk's contents, told a different story, one of assassination arranged by Edward's cousin, Heinrich, who had always envied Edward's position as heir. Within weeks of Edward's death, Heinrich had positioned himself as the new crown prince. Charlotte and her infant son were denounced as impostors when they tried to assert their rights. The marriage was declared a forgery, the child illegitimate. When Charlotte persisted in her claims, threatening to reveal proof of the marriage, she began receiving death threats. Fearing for his sister and nephew's lives, William had helped them flee the country, using his position to gather all documentation that proved their claims. The three of them, William, Charlotte, and the baby, had escaped to Scotland, changing their surname to MacKenzie, derived from Charlotte's middle name, MacKenzie, and purchasing this very farm with what little funds they had managed to bring with them. The most heartbreaking document was a letter from Charlotte to her son, written as she lay dying just 2 years after their escape. In it, she explained his true heritage, but urged him not to pursue his birthright until the political climate changed, fearing he would meet the same fate as his father. "Your time will come," she had written, "but it may not be in your lifetime. The truth must wait until it can triumph without bloodshed." That son had grown up as James MacKenzie, my great-grandfather, raised by William after Charlotte's death. According to the documents, James had honoured his mother's wishes, living as a Scottish farmer while preserving the truth for future generations. The royal connection had gradually faded into family legend, but the documentation had been carefully preserved. What made these documents particularly explosive wasn't just the historical revelation, it was their modern implications. Heinrich's line still ruled Hochwald today. The current monarch, King Christoph IV, was Heinrich's great-grandson, and the country had become an influential member of the European Economic Community. Moreover, Through strategic marriages over generations, the Hochwald royal family had blood ties to several major European monarchies. If these documents were authenticated, they wouldn't just challenge King Christoph's right to rule. They could potentially create succession crises in multiple European countries. And according to the family tree carefully documented among the papers, the legitimate line of succession would lead directly to me. The realization hit me with physical force, causing me to sit back in my chair, a yellowed photograph still, clutched in my trembling hand. It showed Charlotte holding her infant son, Prince Edward, standing proudly beside them. A family portrait that was never officially acknowledged. I was not just Connor MacKenzie, struggling Scottish farmer. If these documents were legitimate, I was Connor Reinhardt von Hochwald MacKenzie, rightful heir to the Hochwald throne. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh out loud. Me, royalty? A man who spent his days worrying about crop yields and equipment, repairs, whose closest advisors were sheep and a faithful dog. It seemed like the plot of a far-fetched novel rather than my actual life, yet the evidence before me was compelling. The documents appeared authentic, with watermarks, seals, and signatures that would be extraordinarily difficult to forge, especially in the 1890s. The photographic evidence matched historical images I found online of Prince Edward and the royal palace. The dates aligned perfectly with the known history of the region, filling gaps in the official narrative with explanations that made logical sense. Most convincing of all was a small gold signet ring nestled in a velvet pouch at the bottom of the trunk. It bore the royal crest of Hochwald, with a small distinguishing mark that, according to William's notes, identified it as belonging specifically to Prince Edward. It had been given to Charlotte on their wedding day, intended as proof of their union, should the need ever arise. As the afternoon light began to fade, I carefully photographed each document using my smartphone, uploading the images to secure cloud storage. Whatever happened next, I wanted to ensure that this evidence couldn't be easily destroyed or suppressed again. My mind raced with questions and possibilities. Should I take these documents to historical authorities? Approach the current Hochwald government? Contact the media? Each path seemed fraught with potential complications. The documents had remained hidden for good reason. Powerful people had already killed once to maintain their position and had spent generations building their legitimacy on a foundation of lies. Moreover, I had my immediate concerns to consider. The farm's foreclosure deadline loomed just weeks away. Whatever historical or royal significance these documents held, they wouldn't automatically solve my financial problems. In fact, they might complicate them enormously if they drew unwanted attention before I could figure out the best course of action. I was so deeply absorbed in these thoughts that the sound of tires on gravel startled me. Rusty's head jerked up, a low growl forming in his throat as he moved to the window. A sleek, black Range Rover with diplomatic plates was coming up my driveway, a vehicle wildly out of place on my struggling farm. Quickly but carefully, I gathered the documents and returned them to the trunk, sliding it beneath the kitchen table just as a firm knock sounded at my door. Rusty positioned himself between me and the entrance, his normally friendly demeanor replaced by watchful caution. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door to find a tall, impeccably dressed man in his 50s, his bearing suggesting military training beneath the expensive suit. Behind him, two younger men waited beside the Range Rover, their attentive posture and scanning eyes identifying them as security personnel despite their civilian clothes. "Mr. MacKenzie," the man asked, his English perfect but marked by a central European accent. "I am Baron Klaus von Reiter, cultural attaché to the Hochwald Embassy in London. I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I believe you have recently discovered items of significant cultural importance to our nation." My blood ran cold. There was no possible way this man could know about my morning's discovery unless my property was being watched. The trunk had been buried for over a century, its existence known only through family stories, yet somehow, within hours of its unearthing, a representative of the very government it could delegitimize was standing at my door. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I'm just a farmer, trying to prepare for spring planting." The Baron's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. MacKenzie, let's not waste each other's time. Our government has maintained an interest in certain historical artifacts that disappeared from our national archives in the late 19th century. We have reason to believe they may have found their way to this property. The Hochwald Historical Preservation Society is prepared to offer appropriate compensation for their return." The practiced ease of his lie was chilling. These documents had never been in any official archives. They had been deliberately suppressed, their very existence denied by the Hochwald government for generations. "As I said, I don't know what you're talking about," I repeated more firmly this time, "and I have work to do before sundown. If your historical society wants to make specific inquiries, they can contact me through official channels." The Baron's pleasant expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps I haven't made myself clear, Mr. MacKenzie. These items, whatever condition they may be in, remain the lawful property of the Hochwald government. Their removal from our country was an act of theft, regardless of how much time has passed. There could be legal complications for anyone found in possession of such items without immediately reporting them." The threat was thinly veiled, but unmistakable. Before I could respond, a second vehicle appeared on my driveway, the familiar truck belonging to Dr. Fiona Campbell, the local Historical Society director and my longtime friend. I had never been so grateful for an interruption. The Baron noted my relief and turned to observe the newcomer with barely concealed annoyance. "We will continue this conversation soon, Mr. MacKenzie," he said quietly. "Consider carefully what is in your best interest, and the interest of preserving this farm that I understand is facing some financial difficulties." As he returned to his vehicle, Fiona approached, her expression curious. "Connor, everything. All right, who was that?" "Cultural attaché from some European embassy," I said vaguely, watching as the Range Rover executed a precise turn and departed down my driveway. "Said they're looking for some historical artifacts." Fiona's eyes narrowed as she watched the departing vehicle. "Diplomatic plates, unscheduled visit to a remote farm, and vague references to artifacts? That's not standard cultural attaché behavior." She turned to me with the sharp perceptiveness that had made her an excellent historian. "Connor MacKenzie, what have you found?" In that moment, I made a decision. Fiona had been my friend since childhood, had a PhD in European history, and had always been fascinated by my grandmother's stories. If anyone could help me understand the true significance of these documents and advise me on how to proceed, it was her. "You'd better come inside," I said, glancing down the empty driveway once more. "Rusty made quite a discovery this morning, and I think I'm going to need your help." As I led her into the kitchen and revealed the trunk's contents, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Baron's visit had been just the opening move in what would become a dangerous game. The documents had remained buried for over a century for good reason. The revelation threatened power structures that would not be surrendered without a fight. Whatever royal blood might run in my veins, I was about to need much more than a birthright to navigate the storm that was coming. The battle for these documents and the truth they contained had officially begun. "These are extraordinary," Fiona whispered, carefully examining the marriage certificate under the kitchen's bright light. Her hands, gloved now with the cotton archival gloves she always kept in her truck, trembled slightly as she turned the delicate paper. If authentic, and they certainly appear to be, these documents would rewrite European royal history. I watched her methodical examination, grateful for her expertise, but increasingly anxious about the wider implications. The Baron's visit makes me think some people already know that, I said, glancing toward the window for what felt like the 100th time. The timing is suspicious, Fiona agreed, looking up from the documents. How could they possibly know you'd found these today? Unless they've been watching the farm, I finished. But why? These documents have been buried for over a century. Why would anyone be monitoring this place now? Fiona carefully set down the marriage certificate and picked up William's journal. Someone in Hochwald must have known or suspected. These documents existed. Perhaps there were rumors in royal circles, records of their disappearance. She flipped through the journal with careful precision. The current royal family would have powerful motivation to recover anything that challenges their legitimacy. Night had fallen outside, casting dark reflections in the windows that made me increasingly uneasy. Rusty sensed my discomfort, staying unusually alert beside me rather than settling into his usual evening nap by the fire. "What exactly did this Baron say?" Fiona asked, making notes on her tablet as she continued examining the documents. I recounted the conversation as accurately as I could, including the thinly veiled threats and his surprising knowledge of my financial situation. "He's not just a cultural attaché," Fiona concluded. "That's diplomatic cover. From what you're describing, he's likely intelligence, perhaps even royal security. The Hochwald monarchy maintains a specialized unit dedicated to protecting the royal family's interests." She met my eyes with newfound seriousness. "Connor, these people won't simply go away. If they believe you have these documents, they'll use whatever means necessary to obtain them." "What about legal protections? These documents were brought here by my ancestors. Surely they're my property now." Fiona's expression grew troubled. "International cultural property law is complicated, especially when it involves royal artifacts. They could make a case that these are state documents illegally removed from Hochwald. The legal battle alone could take years and cost a fortune. Money you don't have. The reality of my situation hit me anew. I was a financially struggling farmer going up against a European government with virtually unlimited resources. Even if I had right on my side, I lacked the practical means to defend that. Right. Perhaps more concerning, Fiona continued, examining Prince Edward's signet ring, is what they might do outside legal channels. Diplomatic immunity provides considerable latitude for activities that would otherwise be illegal. A chill ran through me as I contemplated the implications. You think they'd resort to that? In Scotland, in the 21st century? Monarchies have survived for centuries precisely because they're willing to protect their interests by any means necessary, she replied grimly. The documents in this trunk don't just suggest a historical irregularity, they imply that the entire ruling line of Hochwald is illegitimate. That challenges not just King Christoph's position, but potentially aspects of several European royal families connected through marriages over generations. Our conversation was interrupted by the distinctive ping of an email notification on my phone. When I checked it, my blood ran cold. "It's from Harrington Estates," I said, scanning the message with growing disbelief. "They're withdrawing their offer to purchase the farm. Apparently, they've been informed that the property may be subject to international cultural heritage claims that would complicate any transfer of ownership." Fiona's eyes widened. "They're moving quickly. They're cutting off your financial options." How could they even know about Harrington's offer? I wondered aloud, though the answer seemed increasingly obvious. My communications were being monitored, my financial situation manipulated. "You need legal advice," Fiona decided, pulling out her phone. My brother-in-law specializes in international law. He's in Edinburgh, but I think... The sudden flare of headlights through the window cut her off. Two vehicles were coming up the driveway. The Baron's Range Rover had returned, accompanied by a black sedan. Too late for casual visitors, I observed, feeling Rusty tense beside me. Fiona moved quickly, gathering the most critical documents, the marriage certificate, birth records and William's journal, and placing them in her satchel. These need to be secured properly. I can get them into the university's climate-controlled archive tonight, where they'll be both safe and properly preserved. I nodded, trusting her judgment. What about the rest? Leave the trunk visible, but with less critical items inside. If they insist on searching, finding nothing will make them more suspicious than finding something plausible. She was right. I quickly arranged the remaining items, some old family photographs, farming records and land deeds, back in the trunk, while Fiona slipped out the back door toward the old stone barn, where she'd parked her truck out of sight. The firm knock came just as I closed the trunk's lid. Rusty growled softly as I approached the door, his normally friendly demeanor replaced by protective wariness. Baron von Richter stood on my doorstep, flanked now by three men whose bearing screamed security despite their civilian clothes. Behind them, I could see a third vehicle had joined the convoy, a police car from the local constabulary. "Mr. MacKenzie," the Baron began without preamble. "After our earlier conversation, I consulted with my embassy. I'm now here in an official capacity, accompanied by local authorities, to discuss the suspected presence of stolen Hochwald cultural artifacts on your property." A local officer stepped forward, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Mr. MacKenzie, I'm Constable Murray. We've received a formal diplomatic request to investigate alleged stolen property. I should emphasize that no accusations are being made against you personally at this stage." The careful phrasing suggested the officer was following protocol while trying to distance himself from whatever political machinations were unfolding. I recognized Murray from village events, a decent man caught in an international situation well beyond his usual jurisdiction. "Of course, Constable," I replied, projecting a calm I didn't feel. "I'm happy to cooperate, though I'm not sure what the Baron thinks I have." "Historical documents illegally removed from the Hochwald National Archives in 1891, the Baron supplied. "Smoothly. Family correspondence of the royal household, official state papers, and certain items of royal regalia. Our records indicate they may have been transported to this property by a former employee of the royal household who was dismissed for theft." The lie was delivered with such conviction that even I might have believed it if I hadn't read William's actual journal documenting the truth. This narrative had clearly been carefully crafted over generations to discredit any evidence that might emerge. "I'm not aware of any such items," I said carefully, "though I did recently find an old family trunk with some photographs and farming records. You're welcome to examine it if you like." The Baron's eyes narrowed slightly at my cooperative attitude, clearly having expected resistance. "That would be most helpful, Mr. MacKenzie." I led them into the kitchen, where the trunk sat on the table, lid closed but unlocked. "I was just going through some old family papers this evening. Nothing very exciting, I'm afraid." The Baron approached the trunk, while his associates maintained positions near the doors and windows. His gloved hands opened the lid with practiced care, methodically examining the contents I had arranged. His expression remained neutral, but I could sense his growing frustration as he found nothing matching what he sought. "These appear to be ordinary family records," he said finally, lifting a faded photograph of my grandparents standing before the farmhouse. "Though I would note this trunk itself bears design elements consistent with Hochwald craftsmanship of the late 19th century. It's been in the family for generations," I acknowledged. "I believe my great-great-grandfather brought it when he immigrated from Europe. I didn't realize it might have historical significance. Constable Murray shifted uncomfortably. Well, sir, it seems there's nothing here matching the description of the missing items. Unless you have other concerns, I believe we've fulfilled the diplomatic request for investigation. The Baron's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The trunk itself may constitute cultural property unlawfully removed from Hochwald. I would request it be taken into protective custody, pending authentication. Murray looked increasingly uncomfortable. Sir, I don't have authority to seize family heirlooms without clear evidence of their status as stolen property. The trunk contains Mr. Mackenzie's family papers, and removing it would require a proper warrant based on more substantial evidence. I could see the Baron reassessing his approach, calculating his next move in what was becoming a complex game of international chess played out in my humble kitchen. Perhaps we could discuss this matter further at the embassy, Mr. Mackenzie, he suggested, his tone deceptively pleasant. We would be prepared to offer reasonable compensation for any items of Hochwald origin, regardless of how they came into your family's possession. Such a resolution would be beneficial for all parties, I believe. The implied threat was clear: cooperate voluntarily or face escalating pressure through other channels. I'll certainly consider any official proposal, I replied non-committally, though at the moment I have a farm to run and spring planting to prepare for. As you can see, I'm not hiding anything. The Baron handed me an embossed business card. Please do contact me when you've had time to reflect on your family history more thoroughly. The Hochwald government can be quite generous in resolving such cultural patrimony issues. His gaze swept the modest kitchen, taking in the worn countertops and aging appliances, perhaps generous enough to address other pressing concerns you might have. With that, he nodded to his associates and departed, Constable Murray following with an apologetic glance in my direction. From the window, I watched their vehicles disappear down the driveway, headlights cutting through the darkness before vanishing at the main road. Only when I was certain they were gone did I release the breath I'd been holding. Rusty whined softly, pressing against my leg as if offering support. Moments later, Fiona slipped back through the rear door, her face pale in the kitchen light. I saw them from the barn. Did they buy it? Not entirely, I admitted, but they left without the trunk or any documents. The local police officer wasn't willing to seize anything without better evidence. I sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly, exhausted. This is just the beginning, isn't it? Fiona nodded grimly. The Baron will report back to his superiors. They'll regroup and try different tactics. Legal challenges, financial pressure, surveillance. They might even attempt to question your family history or mental stability if you try to go public with the documents. So what do we do now? We authenticate these documents properly, create secure copies, and find allies. She patted her satchel, containing the most crucial evidence. My colleague at the university specializes in European royal history. He can help verify these materials while maintaining confidentiality. I glanced at the trunk, now containing only ordinary family papers. They'll be watching the farm. Almost certainly, she agreed, which means we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed. She hesitated before adding, Connor, have you considered what this means for you personally? If these documents are authenticated, you have a legitimate claim to the Hochwald throne. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, despite the tension. I'm a farmer, Fiona. The closest I've come to a throne is the tractor seat. I don't want to rule a country. I just want to save my farm. Those two things might be more connected than you realize, she pointed out. The Baron already tried to use your financial situation as leverage. This isn't just about historical truth anymore. It's about your survival, both financial and possibly physical. As if to underscore her point, My phone chimed with another notification. This time it was from the bank, informing me that due to irregularities in my account, all pending transactions had been temporarily frozen and my next mortgage payment might be delayed in processing. "They're squeezing from all sides," Fiona observed, reading the message over my shoulder, "cutting off your financial options, isolating you." Can they really do this? Manipulate private companies, access my emails, freeze my accounts? A determined government with diplomatic resources? Absolutely. Her expression hardened. But they've made a critical mistake. They've revealed how important these documents are by reacting so quickly and aggressively. And in doing so, they've confirmed their authenticity more effectively than any expert analysis could. She was right. The Baron's desperate attempts to secure the documents and the coordinated pressure now being applied could only mean one thing. The Hochwald government believed these papers were genuine and feared their revelation. "We need a plan," I said, scratching Rusty's ears as I tried to think clearly despite my exhaustion. "Somewhere safe to authenticate the documents, allies who can help navigate the legal implications, and a way to protect the farm in the meantime." Fiona nodded, already typing rapidly on her phone. "I'm texting my brother-in-law now. We need to move quickly before they can escalate further." As she worked, I gazed out the window at my darkened fields, the land my family had worked for generations. Somewhere out there, visible or not, people were watching, waiting for me to lead them to the truth my ancestor had buried. The quiet Scottish farm that had been my family's sanctuary for over a century had suddenly become the front line in a battle over royal legitimacy that had been silently raging since before my birth. Whatever happened next, nothing would be the same again. The moment Rusty's paws had uncovered that trunk, my life had irrevocably changed. I was now the custodian not just of my family's land, but of a truth that powerful people had worked for generations to suppress. Dawn arrived with a blood-red sky that seemed ominously appropriate given my circumstances. I'd barely slept, spending most of the night discussing strategy with Fiona and her brother-in-law, Malcolm Fraser, who had joined us via video call shortly after midnight. As one of Scotland's most respected international law experts, Malcolm's insights had been invaluable, if not particularly reassuring. "They'll pursue this through multiple channels simultaneously," he had explained, his academic demeanor belying the seriousness of his assessment. "Diplomatic pressure, legal challenges, financial manipulation, and possibly extra-legal means if those fail. Documents challenging royal legitimacy are considered matters of national security in countries like Hochwald." Now, as I moved through my morning farm chores with Rusty at my heels, Malcolm's words echoed in my mind. The chicken coop needed mending, the sheep required feeding, and the spring planting couldn't wait, royal intrigue notwithstanding. There was something grounding about physical labor, a reminder that regardless of hidden truths and international machinations, the rhythms of farm life continued. By mid-morning, Fiona returned with reinforcements. 3 vehicles came up my driveway. Her truck, followed by a university van marked Department of Historical Preservation, and a Land Rover carrying Malcolm Fraser himself, who had made the 3-hour drive from Edinburgh after our late-night consultation. "I thought we should meet in person," Malcolm explained as he shook my hand firmly. Tall and lean, with prematurely silver hair, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to high-stakes legal battles. "Electronic communications aren't secure enough given what we're dealing with." The university van disgorged a team of 3 specialists led by Dr. Eleanor Sutherland, the head of European Historical Studies at Edinburgh University and, according to Fiona, the country's foremost expert on European royal history. A formidable woman in her 60s, with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes, she approached me with the intensity of someone who had spent decades preparing for precisely this moment. Mr. MacKenzie, she said, clasping my hand in both. Of hers. I've spent my entire career studying the royal succession crisis of 1890s Hochwald. Until now, I've had to rely on official records that I knew were incomplete. What you've discovered could finally provide the missing pieces. Her excitement was palpable, though tempered with professional caution. Of course, we must authenticate everything thoroughly before drawing conclusions. But if your documents are genuine, and Fiona's preliminary assessment suggests they are, this will rewrite a significant chapter of European history. While Dr. Sutherland's team began setting up specialized equipment in my dining room to examine the documents Fiona had secured overnight, Malcolm pulled me aside for a private conversation in the kitchen. "I won't sugarcoat this, Connor," he said, his voice low. "You're in a precarious position legally and personally. The Hochwald government has significant resources and diplomatic leverage. They'll portray you as either a fraud or a thief, possibly both. But these documents belong to my family," I protested. "They were brought here by my ancestors." "That's our position, certainly, but international cultural property law is complicated, especially regarding royal artifacts. They'll argue these are state documents illegally removed during a period of political upheaval." He sighed, removing his glasses to polish them thoughtfully. "More concerning is what they might do outside legal channels. The financial pressure they've already applied is just the beginning. So what's our strategy?" "Multiple layers of protection," Malcolm replied, replacing his glasses. "First, legal countermeasures. I've already filed emergency injunctions preventing any seizure of property from this farm without proper UK judicial review. That won't stop them completely, but it creates procedural hurdles." He nodded toward the dining room where Dr. Sutherland was carefully photographing the marriage certificate. "Second, academic authentication. Eleanor's reputation is unimpeachable. If she verifies these documents, it gives us credibility that will be difficult to dismiss. And third," came a new voice from the doorway, "media leverage. I turned to find a woman I didn't recognize, mid-30s with sharp features and the alert posture of someone who missed nothing. She extended her hand with brisk efficiency. Moira Jenkins, investigative journalist, The Guardian. Fiona called me last night." At my startled expression, she added, "Don't worry, nothing's been published, but a story like this needs to be properly documented from the beginning. If powerful people are already moving against you, public awareness is your best protection." Malcolm nodded in agreement. "Moira is trustworthy and experienced with politically sensitive stories. Having a respected journalist documenting events provides both protection and credibility." The kitchen was becoming crowded as my modest farmhouse transformed into what felt like crisis headquarters. Rusty, normally eager for attention from visitors, had retreated to a corner, watching the proceedings with uncharacteristic wariness. "There's one more ally you should meet," Fiona said, gesturing toward the back door, where an elderly man was making his way slowly toward the house, leaning heavily on a carved walking stick. "Lord Robert Kincaid," Malcolm explained quietly, "former ambassador to several European nations, including Hochwald. He's also Eleanor's cousin and a long-time critic of the current Hochwald regime. If anyone understands the political landscape we're navigating, it's him." Lord Kincaid entered with the deliberate dignity of advanced age, his weathered face bearing the lines of a lifetime in diplomacy. Despite his years, his eyes were sharp and assessing as they took in the activity filling my kitchen. "So you're the young man who's about to upset decades of carefully maintained diplomatic fiction," he said, his voice still carrying the authority of command, despite its age-roughened edges. "I've been waiting 50 years for these documents to surface." I helped him to a chair at my kitchen table, struck by the gravity of his presence. "You knew about them?" "Rumors, whispers in diplomatic circles," he replied, accepting the tea Fiona prepared. The Hochwald royal family has been extraordinarily careful to suppress anything related to Prince Edward's marriage, but in diplomatic service, one learns to recognize the shape of secrets by the effort expended to conceal them. He sipped his tea thoughtfully before continuing. In 1973, when I was stationed in Vienna, a young researcher claimed to have found evidence of Prince Edward's secret marriage in parish records near the Hochwald border. Within a week, she was discredited professionally. Her academic position terminated. The parish records in question were destroyed in an unexplained fire shortly thereafter. The matter-of-fact way he described such ruthless suppression sent a chill through me. And you think they'll do the same now? They'll certainly try, Lord Kincaid confirmed, but they're facing different circumstances. Social media, digital, copies, international academic networks. Information is harder to contain in the 21st century, and they're facing us. His smile carried the confident edge of someone who had spent a lifetime outmaneuvering political adversaries. "I've made arrangements for your safety," Malcolm interjected, bringing the conversation back to immediate concerns. "A trusted security team will be here within the hour. We've also established secure storage for the original documents once Dr. Sutherland's team completes their initial authentication." Moira was taking notes, her expression focused. "What about the farm? The financial pressure they're applying seems designed to force your hand through the foreclosure threat." It was a valid question that cut to the heart of my most immediate concern. Before I could respond, Lord Kincaid cleared his throat. "I've taken the liberty of addressing that particular vulnerability," he said, removing an envelope from his coat pocket. "This contains documentation of a historical preservation grant awarded to this property by the Kincaid Foundation, effective immediately. It's sufficient to cover your mortgage arrears and operating costs for the next 12 months. I stared at him in disbelief. "Lord Kincaid, I can't possibly accept." He waved away my protest with aristocratic dismissal. "Young man, I've spent 50 years watching the Hochwald monarchy perpetuate a historical fraud that distorted European politics. Consider it an investment in historical truth, not charity. Before I could formulate a response, Dr. Sutherland burst into the kitchen, her academic reserve shattered by excitement. "The marriage certificate is genuine," she announced, her voice quivering slightly. "The paper, ink, and notarial seals all date correctly to 1889. The parish insignia matches records we have from St. Matthias Church near the Hochwald Summer Palace. Most conclusively, Prince Edward's signature matches authenticated examples in the British Museum's collection." She held up her tablet displaying side-by-side comparisons of the signatures. Even to my untrained eye, the distinctive flourish at the end of Edward's name was identical in both samples. "What about the birth record?" Fiona asked. "Also authentic." "The child was registered as Edward Wilhelm Reinhard von Hochwald, born to Charlotte MacKenzie Reinhardt and Prince Edward of Hochwald on January 17th, 1890. Dr. Sutherland's eyes met mine with newfound intensity. "Mr. MacKenzie, according to primogeniture laws governing Hochwald succession, you are the rightful heir to the throne." The kitchen fell silent as the full implications settled over us. Lord Kincaid broke the silence with a soft chuckle. "Well, Your Highness," he said with a hint of mischief in his eyes, "I believe this calls for something stronger than tea. The absurdity of the situation, me, a struggling farmer in muddy boots being addressed as royalty while surrounded by academics, lawyers and diplomats in my shabby kitchen, finally broke the tension. A wave of nervous laughter spread through the room, releasing some of the morning's accumulated stress. As Fiona fetched the bottle of scotch I saved for special occasions, Malcolm's phone buzzed. His expression darkened as he read the message. "The Hochwald Embassy has filed a formal claim with the Foreign Office asserting ownership of certain historical documents illegally removed from state archives. They're requesting immediate seizure of all materials and a full investigation." He looked up grimly. "They're also specifically naming you, Connor, as being in possession of stolen state property." "That was quick," Moira observed, still taking notes. "They're escalating faster than I anticipated," Malcolm admitted. "We need to move the original documents to secure storage immediately." Dr. Sutherland nodded. "My team can complete the authentication and process at the university's preservation lab. We've documented enough here to establish chain of custody." Lord Kincaid's expression remained calm, despite the escalating situation. "The Foreign Office will move cautiously. I still have some influence. There, they won't act precipitously on Hochwald's claims without proper review." As the team began packing equipment and documents for transport, I stepped outside onto the porch, needing a moment to process the whirlwind of developments. Rusty followed, pressing against my legs supportively. The spring morning was deceptively peaceful, birds singing, sheep grazing in the lower field, the distant hills shrouded in their usual mist. It seemed impossible that this tranquil landscape had become the center of an international dispute over royal succession. Moira joined me, notepad in hand, but temporarily ignored as she took in the view. "Beautiful land," she observed quietly. "Been in your family long?" "4 generations," I replied. "Since 1891, when William MacKenzie, or Wilhelm von Tauschleben apparently, bought it after fleeing Hochwald. And now you discover you're actually royal. Quite the plot twist." She studied me with journalistic assessment. "How does it feel? Learning your family history is completely different than you thought?" I considered her question carefully, watching. A pair of border collies herding sheep in the distance, neighbors going about their normal farming day, blissfully unaware of the historical drama unfolding on my property. "Honestly, it feels like inheriting another problem," I admitted. "I was already fighting to save the farm. Now I'm fighting powerful people who want to erase my family's history. The royal part seems almost irrelevant compared to those immediate concerns." Moira nodded, seemingly satisfied with my candor. "That's what makes this story compelling. It's not just about royal intrigue, it's about an ordinary person suddenly thrust into extraordinary circumstances, fighting for both his land and historical truth." She turned to face me directly. "The documents are important, Connor, but you're the heart of this story. Your connection to this land, your family's century of silence, your decision about what to do with this unexpected legacy. That's what will resonate with people." Before I could respond, Fiona appeared at the door. "Connor, we need you inside. There's another development. Back in the kitchen, the team had gathered around Malcolm's laptop, which displayed a breaking news story from Hochwald's state media outlet. The headline, translated from German, read, "Historical Society identifies forged royal documents circulating in UK academic circles. They're getting ahead of the story," Moira observed grimly, "establishing a preemptive narrative." Malcolm scrolled through the article, summarizing key points. "They're claiming a sophisticated forgery ring has created false documents about Prince Edward's personal life. They've even named a supposed forger, a disgruntled former palace employee who allegedly created these documents in the 1980s as part of a financial scam." "That's absurd," Dr. Sutherland protested. "The physical evidence clearly dates these documents to the 1890s. No modern forger could replicate the paper composition, ink oxidation, or natural aging patterns we're seeing." Lord Kincaid's expression remained unsurprised. "Standard procedure. Discredit the evidence before it can be properly examined. They're laying groundwork to dismiss whatever we present." "So what's our next move?" I asked, looking around at these unexpected allies who had rallied to my cause. "We proceed on multiple fronts," Malcolm replied decisively. "Dr. Sutherland's team secures and authenticates the originals. Moira documents the process and prepares the public-facing narrative. I continue building legal protections. And Lord Kincaid leverages his diplomatic connections to neutralize foreign pressure. And me, I asked, what do I do while all this is happening? You, Fiona said with a gentle smile, keep farming, maintain normalcy. The more you deviate from your routine, the more ammunition you give them to portray you as something other than what you are, a Scottish farmer who unexpectedly discovered his family's true history. As my unlikely war council continued planning, I found myself staring out the window at the north pasture, where Rusty had made his momentous discovery just yesterday morning. In less than 24 hours, my life had transformed completely. Yet the land remained the same, steady, enduring, unconcerned with royal bloodlines or historical revisions. Whatever came next, that connection to the earth beneath my feet would be my anchor. Royal heir or not, I was still Connor MacKenzie, Scottish farmer, and I intended to keep it that way, regardless of what secrets Rusty had unearthed from the soil of my ancestors. 3 months after Rusty's discovery, I stand at the edge of my north pasture watching the evening light turn the hills golden. The farm has transformed, not into a royal estate, but into something equally meaningful, a protected historical site and working heritage farm. After Dr. Sutherland's authentication made international headlines, the Hochwald government finally acknowledged the truth. Rather than fighting, King Christoph stunned everyone by inviting me to the palace, where we reached an unexpected resolution. I formally renounced any succession claims in exchange for official recognition of my family's history and substantial funding for historic Scottish farms preservation. The truth is, I never wanted a throne. I wanted this land, these sheep, this life my ancestors chose when they fled royal intrigue for honest work. Rusty bounds across the field, still occasionally digging near the Glenning stone as if seeking more treasures. Thanks to him, the farm is secure. My family's true story has been told, and a historical wrong has been acknowledged. Some secrets are buried not to be forgotten, but to be discovered when the time is right. And sometimes it takes a faithful dog to unearth the truth that humans have kept hidden for generations.